It all started on a cold, rainy afternoon. I was driving through the countryside, lost and frustrated, when I saw it, the abandoned asylum. It loomed in the distance, its broken windows and crumbling walls casting eerie shadows against the gray sky. Something about it called to me, like a whisper in the wind. I pulled over, grabbed my camera, and decided to explore. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. As I stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the silence was deafening. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floor creaked with every step. I could feel eyes on me, though I was alone. Or so I thought. I found an old journal in one of the rooms, its pages filled with frantic scribbles. The last entry read, "They're watching. They're always watching." I laughed it off, but deep down I felt a chill I couldn't shake. That night I couldn't sleep. The journal's words kept replaying in my mind. I decided to go back the next day, this time with a flashlight and a friend, Sarah. She was skeptical but curious. As we explored deeper into the asylum, we noticed something strange. The shadows didn't match the light. They moved on their own, twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. Sarah laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We found a room filled with old patient records. One name stood out. Patient 13. Subject exhibits extreme paranoia and claims to see shadow people. As we read, the flashlight flickered. When it came back on, Sarah was gone. I called her name, but the only response was a faint whisper. "They're here." I searched for hours but couldn't find Sarah. The police were no help. They said she probably just left. But I knew better. I went back to the asylum, determined to find her. This time, I brought a voice recorder. As I wandered the halls, I heard whispers, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I played back the recording later that night. My blood ran cold. Beneath the static, I could hear voices. "Help us. Join us." And then, clear as day, Sarah's voice, "I'm still here." I knew I had to go back. Whatever was in that asylum, it had her. I returned with a plan. I had researched the asylum's history and found references to a ritual performed by the staff to calm the patients. It involved lighting candles in a specific pattern and chanting. Desperate, I decided to try it. As I lit the candles, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The shadows swirled around me, but I kept chanting. Suddenly, the room went silent. The candles flickered out, and I was plunged into darkness. When I turned on my flashlight, I saw her. Sarah, standing in the corner, her eyes hollow. She smiled and said, "You shouldn't have come back." Then she vanished. I found more records hidden in a locked room. The asylum wasn't just a place for the mentally ill, it was a testing ground for experiments. The staff had tried to harness the patient's fear, believing it could open a doorway to another realm. They succeeded, but at a terrible cost. The shadows were the result, entities that fed on fear and trapped souls. I realized Sarah wasn't just missing, she was trapped. The ritual I performed had only made things worse. The shadows were stronger now, more aggressive. I could feel them closing in, their whispers turning to screams. I knew what I had to do. The only way to free Sarah and the others was to close the doorway. But it required a sacrifice. Someone had to take their place. I went back one last time, armed with nothing but my resolve. The shadows were everywhere, their forms twisting and writhing. I found Sarah in the same room, her eyes filled with tears. "You can't save me," she said, but I refused to believe that. I began the ritual again, this time with a different chant, one to seal the doorway. As I spoke the final words, the shadows lunged at me. I felt a cold, searing pain, and then nothing. When I woke up, I was outside the asylum, the sun shining brightly. Sarah was beside me, alive but shaken. The asylum was gone, reduced to rubble. We never spoke of what happened, but I could still feel them sometimes. The shadows, watching, waiting. The doorway was closed, but I knew it wasn't permanent. I kept the journal, a reminder of the horrors I had faced. And every now and then I'd hear a whisper, a faint echo of the asylum's dark past. I had saved Sarah, but at a cost. The shadows were still out there, and they would never stop watching. I never believed in ghosts. Not until I drove down that cursed stretch of desert highway. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a way to shave a couple of hours off my trip to Vegas. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I felt an unease settle in my chest. The road stretched endlessly before me, flanked by nothing but barren desert and the occasional skeletal remains of long-dead trees. The first sign that something was wrong came when my radio crackled to life, spitting out static and faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. I turned it off, but the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind. Then came the shadows, figures darting across the road, just out of the corner of my eye. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. I told myself it was just fatigue, the result of driving for hours under the relentless desert sun. But deep down, I knew better. Something was out there, watching me, waiting for me. The night deepened and the temperature dropped. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt ahead. That's when I saw him, a man standing by the side of the road, thumb outstretched. He wore a tattered jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. "Need a ride?" I asked, rolling down the window. He nodded silently and slid into the passenger seat. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I tried to make small talk, but he remained silent, his head bowed. After a few miles, I glanced over and saw that his seat was empty. My heart raced as I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. I searched the car, but there was no trace of him. No footprints leading away from the vehicle, no sign that he had ever been there at all. Shaken but determined to press on, I continued down the highway. The whispers returned, louder this time, and I could make out words. "Turn back. You don't belong here. Leave while you still can." Then I saw them. A convoy of ghostly vehicles, their headlights glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. They moved in perfect formation, gliding silently over the road. I tried to steer clear, but they surrounded me, their spectral drivers staring straight ahead with hollow eyes. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white, as the convoy led me deeper into the desert. The landscape shifted, the familiar dunes replaced by jagged cliffs and twisted, leafless trees. I was no longer on the highway. I was in a place that shouldn't exist. The convoy vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving me stranded in the middle of a desolate town. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered and doors hanging off their hinges. A sign, barely legible, read "Welcome to Black Sands." I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the silence was oppressive. I called out, but my voice echoed back at me, distorted and unnatural. As I explored the town, I found remnants of its former inhabitants, a child's doll lying in the dust, a rusted bicycle leaning against a wall, a dinner table set for a meal that was never eaten. It was as if the entire population had vanished in an instant. Then I saw them, the shadows, moving in the windows watching me. I ran back to my car, but the engine wouldn't start. I was trapped. Night fell, and the town came alive with whispers and ghostly apparitions. I took refuge in an old saloon, barricading the door with whatever I could find. The spirits outside wailed and moaned, their voices filled with anguish and rage. I found a journal on the bar, its pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to a man named Samuel Hargrove, the town's last sheriff, he wrote of a curse that had befallen Black Sands, a curse born of greed and betrayal. The townsfolk had made a deal with a malevolent entity, promising it their souls in exchange for wealth and prosperity. But the entity had tricked them, taking their lives instead. As I read, the temperature in the saloon dropped, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see a figure cloaked in shadows, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. It spoke, its voice a guttural growl. "You should not have come here." The entity loomed over me, its form shifting and writhing like smoke. It offered me a choice: join the spirits of Black Sands or face a fate worse than death. Desperation clawed at my mind, but I refused to give in. I remembered something Samuel had written in his journal, a way to break the curse. It required a sacrifice, a willing soul to take the place of the entity and free the trapped spirits. I knew what I had to do. With trembling hands, I recited the incantation Samuel had scribbled in the margins of the journal. The entity howled in fury as the ground beneath us began to shake. The walls of the saloon crumbled, and the spirits of Black Sands emerged, their faces filled with hope. The entity's form began to dissolve, its power waning as the curse was lifted. But it wasn't enough. The spirits needed a new anchor, someone to take the entity's place. I stepped forward, offering myself as the sacrifice. As the entity vanished, the spirits of Black Sands were freed, their forms dissipating into the night. The town began to fade, the buildings crumbling into dust. I felt a strange peace wash over me as I took the entity's place, becoming the new guardian of Black Sands. Now, I watch over the desert highway, ensuring that no one else falls victim to the curse. The whispers have stopped and the shadows are gone. But I am still here, bound to this place for eternity. If you ever find yourself driving down that lonely stretch of road, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't stop for the hitchhiker. It all started with the whispers. I had just moved into the suburban house on Maplewood Drive, a quaint little neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. The house was perfect, spacious, with a large backyard and a basement that I planned to turn into a home office. But from the very first night, I felt something off. The basement was cold, even in the middle of summer. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and there was a faint smell of damp earth that no amount of cleaning could erase. But it was the whispers that really got to me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the pipes. But as the days went by, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were coming from the walls. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But then, one night, as I was working late in the basement, I heard it. A voice, clear as day, calling my name. "Sarah." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the faint sound of the whispers, growing louder, more insistent. I grabbed my laptop and ran upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the voice calling my name over and over again. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I was just tired from the move. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was in the basement, and it knew my name. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more persistent. I tried to avoid the basement, but it was impossible. I had to go down there to do laundry, to get to the fuse box, to retrieve boxes of old belongings. Every time I did, the whispers followed me, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Then one night, I saw it. I was in the basement searching for a box of winter clothes when I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could have sworn I heard my name again. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, lurking in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I watched, the shadow began to move. It shifted, twisted, and then, slowly, it started to take shape. It was a figure, tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that reached out towards me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the figure began to move closer. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, like ice against my skin. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized that they were coming from the shadow itself. I turned and ran, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't stop until I was upstairs, in the safety of my bedroom. I locked the door and sat on the bed, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadow was real. It was in my basement, and it was watching me. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The shadow, the whispers, they were real, and they were in my house. I had to find out what was going on. I started researching the history of the house, digging through old records, and talking to neighbors. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. The house had a dark past. Decades ago, a family had lived here, a mother, father, and their young daughter. One night, the father had gone mad, locking his family in the basement and setting the house on fire. The mother and daughter had died, but the father had disappeared, never to be seen again. The whispers, the shadow, it all made sense now. The basement was haunted, and the spirits of the mother and daughter were trapped there, unable to move on. But there was more. As I dug deeper, I found an old blueprint of the house. There was a hidden door in the basement, one that led to a secret room. The previous owners had sealed it off, but I knew I had to find it. I went back down to the basement, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar. The whispers were louder than ever, and I could feel the shadow watching me as I searched for the hidden door. It took hours, but finally, I found it. A small, almost invisible seam in the wall. I pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the earth. The air was even colder here, and the whispers were deafening. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The staircase led to a small hidden room buried deep beneath the house. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves, filled with jars and bottles of strange, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a table, covered in yellowed papers and old, rusted tools. But what caught my attention was the altar. It was a small stone structure, covered in strange symbols and carvings. On top of it was a blackened, charred object, a doll, or what was left of one. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I could feel the malevolence radiating off of it, like a dark, oppressive force. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and I realized that they were coming from the doll. It was the source of the shadow, the source of the haunting. The spirits of the mother and daughter were trapped here, bound to the doll by some dark, ancient magic. I knew I had to destroy it. I grabbed the doll, ignoring the cold, slimy feel of its surface, and smashed it against the altar. The whispers turned into screams, loud and piercing, and the shadow surged forward, enveloping me in its icy grip. I fought against it, struggling to break free, but it was too strong. The darkness closed in around me, and I felt myself being pulled into the void. I woke up in the hidden room, the doll lying shattered on the floor. The whispers were gone, but the shadow was still there, looming over me like a predator waiting to strike. I knew I had to finish what I started. The doll was destroyed, but the spirits were still trapped. I had to perform a ritual, something to break the bond and set them free. I searched through the papers on the table looking for anything that could help. Finally, I found it. A ritual, written in an old, crumbling book. It was dangerous, but I had no choice. I had to try. I gathered the materials, candles, herbs, a knife, and began the ritual. The shadow watched me, its form shifting and twisting as I chanted the ancient words. The air grew colder, the pressure in the room building until it felt like the walls were closing in. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The shadow was gone, the whispers silenced. The room was quiet, peaceful even. I had done it. I had set the spirits free. But as I turned to leave, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around, and there she was, the little girl, her eyes wide and pleading. "Thank you," she whispered before fading away into the darkness. I thought it was over. The spirits were gone, the basement was quiet, and I could finally breathe again. But I was wrong. A few days after the ritual, I started hearing noises again. Footsteps, creaking floorboards, the sound of someone moving around in the basement. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then I saw him. The father. He was standing in the corner of the basement, his eyes hollow, his face twisted into a mask of rage. He was the one who had started all of this, the one who had trapped his family in the basement and set the house on fire. And now, he was back. I tried to ignore him, to convince myself that he wasn't real, but he was. He was there, watching me, waiting for his chance to strike. I knew I had to stop him, but I didn't know how. The ritual had worked on the mother and daughter, but the father was different. He was stronger, more powerful. He wasn't bound by the same rules. I had to find a way to banish him, to send him back to whatever hell he had come from. But I was running out of time. The father's presence grew stronger with each passing day. The basement was his domain now, and he made sure I knew it. The temperature would drop suddenly, the air growing so cold I could see my breath. The whispers returned, but this time they were different. Harsh, guttural, filled with malice. I knew I couldn't fight him alone. I needed help. I reached out to a local paranormal investigator, a man named Dr. Grayson, who had experience dealing with malevolent spirits. He agreed to come to the house and assess the situation. When Dr. Grayson arrived, he immediately sensed the dark energy emanating from the basement. He set up his equipment, EMF detectors, infrared cameras, and a digital recorder, and we descended into the depths of the house. The moment we stepped into the basement, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. The shadow of the father appeared, more solid and menacing than ever before. Dr. Grayson began to speak in a calm, authoritative voice, commanding the spirit to leave this plane and move on. But the father wasn't going to go quietly. The temperature plummeted, and the shadow lunged at us, its form shifting and contorting into something monstrous. Grayson and I fought back, using every tool and technique at our disposal. We chanted incantations, burned sage, and even used a crucifix to try and repel the spirit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the father's form began to waver. His screams echoed through the basement as he was pulled back into the void, his essence dissipating into nothingness. The basement fell silent. The air warmed, and the oppressive weight lifted. Dr. Grayson and I stood there, breathless and exhausted, but victorious. As we left the basement, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The house was finally free of its dark past. The spirits of the mother and daughter had been set free, and the father had been banished. But as I locked the basement door behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The house had been cleansed, but the memory of what had happened would always linger. And sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet, I could still hear the faintest whisper calling my name. Sarah. I never believed in curses, not until I heard the whisper. It was a dry, rasping sound, like sand sliding over stone, and it came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I was standing at the edge of the oasis, the one they called Al-Maut, the water of death. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of life in the middle of the endless desert. But that day, it felt like anything but. The whisper came just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. It was a single word, barely audible, but it sent a chill down my spine. Leave. I laughed it off at first. The desert plays tricks on you, they say. The heat, the isolation, it can make you hear things that aren't there. But as I turned to walk back to camp, the whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. Leave now. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the weight of 1,000 and then I saw them. Shapes, figures, emerging from the shadows. They were humanoid but distorted, their bodies made of sand and shadow, their eyes glowing like embers. They circled my tent, their movements slow and deliberate, and I could feel their hunger, their malice. I didn't sleep that night. By morning the figures were gone, but the camp was in worse shape than ever. 2 of our group were missing, Ahmed and Layla. Their tents were empty, their belongings untouched. The only clue was a single footprint in the sand, leading away from camp and toward the oasis. We followed the trail, though every step felt like a mistake. The oasis loomed ahead, its waters still and black, reflecting the pale morning light like a mirror. And there, on the shore, we found them. Ahmed and Layla were kneeling in the sand, their heads bowed, their hands resting on the surface of the water. They didn't move as we approached, didn't respond when we called their names. It was as if they were in a trance. I reached out to shake Ahmed's shoulder, but the moment I touched him, he collapsed, his body crumbling into sand. Layla followed, her form dissolving into the same fine golden grains. The whisper came again, louder now, echoing in my mind. You cannot escape. I looked down at my hand, the one that had touched Ahmed, and saw it, a mark like a brand etched into my skin. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, but it pulsed with a faint, sickly light. The others saw it too, and they backed away, their eyes wide with fear. I was marked, and I knew, deep in my soul, that the oasis would never let me go. The days blurred together after that. The mark on my hand burned, a constant reminder of the curse that bound me to the oasis. The others avoided me, whispering among themselves, and I couldn't blame them. I could feel the change in me, the way the desert seemed to call to me, to pull me closer. One night, I woke to find myself standing at the edge of the oasis, the mark on my hand glowing faintly. The whisper was there, but it was different now, more coherent, more deliberate. It spoke of an ancient power, a guardian that slept beneath the sands, waiting to be awakened. I didn't want to listen, but the whisper was relentless. It guided me to a spot near the center of the oasis, where the water was deepest. I knelt, my hand trembling as I reached into the water. The moment my fingers touched the surface, the ground beneath me shook, and the water began to churn. Something was rising from the depths, a figure, massive and imposing, made of sand and stone. Its eyes glowed with the same sickly light as the mark on my hand, and its voice was the whisper, now amplified, echoing in my mind. You have awakened me. Now you will serve. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me shifted, trapping me in place. The guardian reached out, its hand closing around my arm, and I felt its power surge through me, binding me to it. I was no longer just marked. I was its vessel. The guardian's presence in my mind was overwhelming. It whispered constantly, filling my thoughts with visions of the past, of the oasis as it once was, a place of life and abundance, and of the curse that had turned it into a trap. I saw the people who had come before me, drawn to the oasis by its promise of salvation, only to be consumed by its darkness. I tried to fight it, to resist its influence, but it was no use. The mark on my hand spread, tendrils of light creeping up my arm, and with each passing day I felt less like myself and more like a puppet, controlled by the guardian's will. The others in the camp began to notice. They saw the way I stared into the distance, the way I spoke in riddles, the way the sand seemed to move around me, as if it were alive. They tried to help me, but I pushed them away, afraid of what the guardian might do if they got too close. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. I was alone now. The camp was empty, the tents abandoned, and the whisper was louder than ever. The guardian's voice filled my mind, demanding a final sacrifice to complete the ritual, to fully awaken its power. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me. I stood at the edge of the oasis, the mark on my hand glowing brighter than ever. The water was still, but I could feel the guardian beneath the surface, waiting. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding in my chest, and stepped into the water. It was cold, colder than anything I had ever felt, and it pulled me down, deeper and deeper, until I could no longer see the surface. The whisper was deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all screaming in unison: serve, obey, sacrifice. I closed my eyes, ready to give in, ready to let the darkness take me. But then in the depths of my mind I heard another voice, a voice that was my own. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there, and it gave me the strength to fight. I don't know how I did it, but I broke free. The guardian's hold on me shattered, and I felt the mark on my hand fade, the light extinguishing as if it had never been there. The water around me churned, and I was thrust to the surface, gasping for air. The oasis was silent. The whisper was gone, the guardian's presence vanished. I crawled to the shore, my body trembling, and collapsed on the sand. I don't know how long I lay there, but when I finally opened my eyes, the sun was rising, casting its golden light over the desert. The oasis was still, its waters clear and calm, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt at peace. I left the desert that day, and I never looked back. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I still hear the whisper, faint and distant, as if it's calling me to return. And I know, deep down, that the oasis is still waiting. Its curse unbroken, its guardian slumbering beneath the sands. And one day, it will awaken again. I never believed in the stories. Not really. The tales of the ancestral grounds were just that, stories. Legends passed down from generation to generation, whispered around campfires to scare children into obedience. But that was before I saw the mark. It was a simple thing, really. A single, jagged line carved into the ancient oak at the edge of the forest. The elders called it the Mark of the Forgotten, a symbol that had not been seen in over a century. They said it was a warning, a sign that the spirits of the ancestral grounds were restless. But I was young and foolish, and I didn't listen. That night, the air grew heavy, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The shadows danced in ways that defied logic, and the wind carried whispers that chilled me to the bone. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. By morning, the first body was found. The body was unrecognizable, torn apart as if by some wild beast, but there were no animals in the ancestral grounds. Not anymore. The elders said the trees had taken him, that they were alive and hungry. I laughed at the idea, but my laughter died in my throat when I heard the whispers. They came from the trees themselves, a low, guttural murmuring that seemed to echo in my mind. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called my name. I ran, but no matter how far I went, the whispers followed. They were in my head, in my dreams, in my very soul. I couldn't escape them. The mist rolled in on the third day, thick and unnatural. It clung to the ground like a living thing, twisting and curling around my feet as I walked. I could feel it watching me, though I couldn't see anything through the dense fog. Then I saw it, a shadow, tall and impossibly thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. It didn't walk. It glided, as if it were part of the mist itself. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but I knew better. The shadow was real, and it was coming for me. I ran again, but the mist followed, and so did the shadow. It was always there, just out of reach, waiting. The moon turned red on the fourth night, casting an eerie glow over the ancestral grounds. The elders said it was a sign, a harbinger of doom. They were right. The forest came alive that night. The trees twisted and groaned, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground beneath my feet shifted and cracked, as if something beneath the surface was trying to break free. And then there were the eyes. Hundreds of them, glowing in the darkness, watching me from every direction. I could feel their hatred, their hunger. They wanted me, and I knew I couldn't run forever. They came on the fifth day, the forgotten ones, spirits of those who had died in the ancestral grounds, their souls trapped for eternity. They were twisted, grotesque versions of the people they had once been, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and despair. They spoke to me, their voices a cacophony of pain and anger. They told me of the mark, of the curse it carried. They said it was a gateway, a way for the spirits to cross over into our world, and they said it was my fault. I didn't understand at first, but then I remembered. I had been the one to find the mark, the one to disturb the ancient oak. I had unleashed the curse, and now I had to pay the price. The elders told me there was only one way to break the curse, a ritual, ancient and dangerous. It required a sacrifice, a life for a life. I didn't want to believe them, but I had no choice. The spirits were growing stronger, and the ancestral grounds were becoming more dangerous by the hour. I prepared the ritual as the elders instructed, gathering the necessary ingredients and drawing the sacred symbols in the dirt. My hands shook as I lit the candles, and my heart pounded in my chest as I began to chant. The spirits howled in rage, their voices shaking the very ground beneath me. I could feel their power, their hatred, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The ritual worked, but not in the way I had hoped. The curse was broken, but the price was higher than I could have imagined. The spirits were banished, but they took something with them, something precious. I felt at the moment it happened, a piece of my soul being ripped away. I screamed, but no sound came out. The world around me faded, and I was left alone in the darkness. The ancestral grounds are quiet now, but the mark remains. It's a reminder of what I've lost, of the price I paid. And though the spirits are gone, I can still feel their presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. I am the forgotten one now, cursed to wander the ancestral grounds for eternity. And I know that one day, the mark will return and the cycle will begin again. But this time, I'll be ready.